Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be with Mia Togo today. Mia is a yoga teacher trainer, really, primarily, and a coach, and somebody that knows grief very well. So I appreciate you being here, Mia, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you. Thanks,
And to
Tara.
share locations, really.
Yes, we're neighbors.
We are neighbors in London, but you're originally from California. So, yeah, maybe first you could tell the listeners a little bit about your own personal relationship with grief and how that is over different situations as well.
Yeah, it's a long and very convoluted story. So I'll try and keep it brief. Yes, I'm from California and Los Angeles, and I moved here about a little less than 5 years ago. But before that, a long, long journey. And I think I was thinking about when I really felt my first relationship with grief. I was about 10. I had a dog that I was always obsessed with animals as a kid. So I got a dog when I was about 5, and her name, I loved The Wizard of Oz, loved it, loved it. So I got a little black dog, and I named this little black dog Dorothy, not Toto. I always think back to my little self. I'm like, that's interesting. I picked Dorothy because Dorothy is so much the hero's journey. And my little 5-year-old self really connected to that. So when I was about 10, my dad's from Hawaii and my grandparents were having their 50th wedding anniversary in Hawaii. So we went there for a week, and someone was watching Dorothy, and Dorothy was my best friend. And when we got back, I could still remember what I had on. I can still remember everything around me. I got off the plane when we returned from Hawaii, and I was told at the airport that my dog had gotten out and went on the freeway and was killed. So my whole body was flooded with grief. And my mom and I just still remember we're crying and just so upset at the airport. And it was so interesting after that feeling that extreme loss. And I can't really remember how my parents tried to help me through that loss, but it was a really sad, painful, just something ripped away so quickly. It's hard to process at any time. And I always look at grief too as losing, not just losing people, but losing beloved animals and sometimes relationships and just going through loss in general. So about 10 years later, when I would start to travel as I was older, I would feel myself when I go away. This is before cell phones. I was always trying to find some kind of phone to check on my dog and just make sure everything was okay. And I could feel this repetitive fear of grief and worry that something bad was going to happen again. So that and a bunch of other things led me to the direction of studying psychology. So I went to UCLA in California, and my background's in psychology and therapy. And so as I was going through that work, it led me to a really pivotal person in my life, and she was a coach. A lot of traditional therapy for me didn't work because I could identify a lot of the problems, but really how to process and heal these repetitive patterns wasn't really getting addressed. It was more than just a cognitive thought process. It was something I was feeling deeply in my body. So I was able to do this work with, her name was Mona Miller, for many years. And as I was doing this work with Mona, I started to move into teacher training and started practicing yoga. So for me, yoga was very much bringing the spiritual, the psychology, the philosophy into the yoga practice. And that's what I loved about yoga, because I have a dance background. So the movement, the breath, but really bringing so many things into integration. And when I was going through, right when I was going through my teacher training, my mom got sick. Well, she had a stroke, and she went into the hospital, and then she went into a coma, and she never came out of the coma. And she was in the coma for about 2 months. And during that time, they just said, basically your mom will never come. She's not going to come back. And if she does, she'll be in a convalescent state, and the brain damage is severe. So we basically had to make the decision to take her. She was on feeding tubes that kept her alive. So we would, spend time with her, visit with her, and we all had the family meeting of what do we do? And it was so hard. I was the last one to agree, because, you feel like you're doing the last thing you want to preserve my mother's life, but we had to let her go. And we knew that that's not how she wanted to live. So we decided to take her off feeding tubes, and it took a while. It took, like a couple of weeks for my mom to pass. And it was a really painful experience. And, like some of the guilt that came up with it, and my heart and soul, my spiritual self knew it was the right thing. And that felt very clear. But that little girl inside of me that, loves and always wants to be with my mom had such a hard time of making that decision. So that type of grief and having to make that choice in some ways was really painful. And after that too, I was going through another loss of, I've gone through a lot of loss of my beloved animals who it's called the Rainbow Bridge, that I've helped transition over the Rainbow Bridge because of different kidney failure and different things. And one of my beloved dogs that I had to let pass in my arms in my living room, when that happened, I really felt this hole inside of me just kind of pull open. So much grief that had been sitting. I processed it to the best of my ability, but grief for me is not a linear process. It's circular. It comes back, and making space for it. I always say you got to get close to the ground, just get close to the ground to be held. And when that woke up, I really felt that there was something missing in my marriage at the time, and it pulled something so deeply open. So I started to segue, if you will, and unconsciously uncouple as best I could with my husband, which was really painful because that brought up, again, more guilt because I was hurting somebody who loved me, but it just didn't feel like the right thing, without going into detail. And as I was going through the death of my marriage and the death of my dog, my teacher, Mona Miller, who I'd worked with for many years, I had not seen her for a little while. And I just said, look, I really feel like I need to come back and be and process some of this grief and this pain that I'm feeling. It's really overwhelming. And it was bringing up the death of my mom, all of it. So through that process, she said, I think it'd be really great if you did a session with my ex-boyfriend who I had originally started seeing Mona with, the reason, sort of the catalyst why I'd started seeing her. And I was like, oh, well, I don't really see that, but okay, I trust your judgment. I will do this. And so I had this session set for Monday morning at 8:30. It was out in the Valley in California, if you know the Valley. It was my session that I had always had for years. And I lived in Santa Monica, so you kind of drive over the hill. So I was getting ready on Monday morning, kind of excited to see her, and kind of this weird trepidation of like seeing my ex, hadn't seen him in a while. And also knowing that I was being called to go through some kind of process with this. So I get a phone call from, his name's Conrad. I get a phone call and I see it come in. I'm like, hey, I answered, I'm like, going to see you shortly. This is going to be interesting. He's like, there was silence. And he said, I don't know how to tell you this, but Mona was killed this weekend in a car accident. And I was like, first of all, it was disbelief. And I was like, what? Is it okay to curse? It was like, what the hell? I tend to curse on podcasts. I'm like, what the fuck? I was like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're mistaken. This cannot happen. And of course it did. And there was something about that pivot of going to the person who held the space that nurtured me through so much of my life and taught me how to rinse and process my pain, and was going to help me process the grief of my mom and the grief of my marriage and my dog and all of it, then was killed in this horrific car accident, brutally ripped away. And I was like, what the hell? So that my relationship with grief and loss, shortly after that, I ended up in the hospital, and they didn't know what was wrong with me. They did a spinal tap, and they figured out it was, for me, my whole system was just being flooded with fear and pain and sadness. As we know as yogis, there's no separation. The body, the mind, the energy was being flooded in my kidneys. So I got a really bad kidney infection. And I had to lay in bed for a couple of weeks and do nothing, and just nothing, and rest. And when we went to Mona's, because Mona was beloved by a lot of people, and we went to her kind of like celebration of her life. And she taught a lot of us how to do rinsing work. And rinsing work is how to physically rinse pain, anger, sadness when we get triggered or activated. so it doesn't sit in our body. So we're in relationship with it. And we all kind of joked, we're like, we're so fucking angry. We all need to do so much anger work right now. We're so mad at her. How could you leave us, Mona? So I know like for me, the different stages of feeling that grief and that pain also is a catalyst of it's time to take her work out into the world. So my background in psychology and therapy and coaching, I was going to go back and do my PhD in psychology. And she had actually encouraged me not to. She said, some people need to, and it's not a judgment. She said, some people really need to do that. She said, you've done this work for so long. It is in your body. You trust it. And she was going to do kind of like a teacher training for some of us who had studied with her for a long time, literally that fall. And then when she died, I was like, oh no, this is the call. This is the call. And if you will, kind of the hero's journey back to my dog, Dorothy, of like taking this work and what you've learned and how you've processed and come through the other side. And we're never done, but how to really bring the work that I learned with her and through her that was so life altering and changing to bring it out into the world. So that's when I started doing my coaching work along with, I had already been teaching yoga for a little while and leading teacher trainings for Yoga Works in the US. So I have a very long, rich history with grief. And so much of the work I've done with Mona and my own work is learning to be in relationship. Actually, a book I'm writing right now called All Vibes Welcome, to be in relationship with all the feelings that we have, that they're teachers and they're like the palette of all the different colors that make up who we are. So learning to be in relationship with sorrow and sadness and grief is so important in order to understand so much of our spiritual connection to who we are and why we're here and what we're doing. So I know that's a lot, but I could keep going, but I'm just going to pause there. And that's kind of my history with it in a nutshell. But there's also a lot of nuance to it as well.
Well, thank you so much, firstly, for sharing with us. Everybody who will be listening will really see, that you're somebody that knows this subject so well. And I don't know, from the story of Mona, it's so fascinating, actually, that you had that support of Conrad that day, that you found that out, that you were together. Yeah, just what a shock that must be.
Yeah. And what a shock. And what's so fascinating too is he was a lot of the catalyst of why I started seeing Mona, because when we started dating, I was in my mid-20s and life in your mid-20s and what you're figuring out. And a lot of the drama that we were trying to figure out is the reason we started seeing her, because his father and brother were both seeing Mona because they were all addicts, recovered addicts. I am not, or was not, but those of us who like to be in relationship with addicts have our own issue with, obviously, codependent. So that was a big, it was like a full circle of coming back, the beginning and an ending of something that was also, I always say endings are also new beginnings. So that ending was also a new beginning for a different trajectory of the work that I do and what she really inspired in me.
And I know that you talk about, Mona's work in your Instagram stories, and I hear you use this word of, rinsing. So perhaps you could explain a little bit more about this technique, if you like, that you use with your clients.
Yeah, I will. So rinsing, there's no water involved. Sometimes people are like, "Is there water involved?" I'm like, no. But feelings are connected to the water element, right? Feelings and emotions. And our capacity to feel is so important because it is a conduit, is a teacher of like what and how we need to regulate and respond to what's going on inside of us. And so many of us are not taught to feel pain. And like that conversation, like how many people really want to sit down and like, let's talk about grief and sadness. People are like, no, thanks. I'd rather go drink at the bar or do something like numb it out or shop. Or I feel like there's such an addict energy in the world. And I don't mean this with a judgment. And I'm not even talking about 12-step addiction. I'm just talking about addict energy as something we want to do or engage with to get out of a bad feeling. And there is no good or bad feeling. It's just what we've learned and what we've been programmed. It's like, especially as women, anger is bad. Don't be angry. Be a nice girl. Put on a happy face. Be so pleasant. Sadness is weak. And so we're so disconnected from our anger and our sadness and how to really be in relationship and soothe and respond to those places that are asking us to be tender, right? And so if we cut ourselves off from a lot of what I call shadow emotions and feelings because we've been told to not go there and shut it down, then we're shutting down like just a huge part of who we are. And being in wholeness, and yoga is union. It's like coming into wholeness. We can't silo and siphon off parts of who we are to create an image or a presentation that is pleasing and acceptable. And I think that narrative is, it's especially in, if we look at colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, that narrative is strong. And that's just what we're unpacking and dismantling right now. And that's something I started dismantling when I was a young girl. I really saw this fucked up thought system as like, no, don't like who you are, don't like your body, question everything about yourself. And I was like, no, wait a minute. If I am stuck in a narrative of self-hate and self-doubt, I am disempowering myself. And so many of us have been programmed. So then we're led. We're like little sheep. It's like, you just do what I want you to do. You buy what I want you to buy. You're at war with yourself. So Mona's book was called Invisible Warfare. And the idea is, in a nutshell, it's like, if we want visible peace in the world with other people and within ourselves, we have to heal our invisible war. And so many of us are walking around this world at war with ourselves. And I know that to be true. And so it's like, everybody, like, let's not bullshit ourselves. But with love, it's like, well, what is that war about? And to unpack it and go into the strata and the substrata. So the rinsing work is letting your emotions and your feelings have a way to have worth. They are not I always say this, what you are feeling when you're dysregulated or upset, it's not necessarily the truth, but it feels very real and true for you at that moment. So to deny it and repress it or shut it down does not make it go away. It's like electricity. Once electricity is out, you're trying to put the genie back in the bottle. And what happens is it all sits down there in the subconscious, and it keeps sitting down there until something in our current life or experience. That's why people are like, that was such a stupid fight, or that was just so dumb. I'm like, because it's not about the thing. The thing just activated our reactivity to the moment, which pulled up in the subconscious a shit ton of stuff that we have not dealt with in the past. And so that's why it becomes this overwhelm of reactivity, and we're so triggered. So when we learn, like, oh my gosh, I always say triggers are teachers. This trigger that's coming up in me, and this takes courage, because it's easy to blame. It's so easy to blame and judge everybody else. And, we live in a world that's very blamey and judgy. It's like, look at that person, look at what they're doing. So it's sort of like, well, it's a distraction from me actually feeling what's going on in my own process. So if I give myself permission, so I have a place in my house, and I have a tennis racket, or you the bopper, where you actually, when you're feeling, and it's not just anger, it can be sadness or grief, you hit the side of the bed or a pillow with a tennis racket. There's rules to rinsing. You don't hit your head. You don't break things. You don't ever hurt anybody else. But you give your hurt and your pain a safe, sacred ritual of releasing. So as animals do in the wild, they go through a traumatic experience and they shake it off. You watch it, like Peter Levine's work of studying animals in the wild, like polar bears and squirrels, and how to discharge pain as it's happening. Then the animal just kind of runs off, is like, I'm fine. But we have painful experiences, and especially as children, if we're not taught, or we're in painful households, whether there's physical abuse, mental abuse, sometimes neglect, and there's not someone there to parent and hold us and nurture us and help us understand, we bury that pain and it gets lodged into our bodies. So that's why thinking our way through our upsets and our hurts is helpful, but thinking it doesn't allow it to move through and actually have a way to rinse so that we can process where it lives and reparent. Oftentimes, a lot of us need to be reparented, even if you had a relatively, like my childhood is very loving in a lot of ways, but I also had, intergenerational trauma. And I knew that when I was a teenager, before there was any books about it. I was like, okay, I'm living out some trauma. I am behaving in a way that is not justified by what's happening. What is that? I was always so curious. And it was the intergenerational trauma that I was learning and picking up through energy. And this is what we do. It's modeled for us, or it's not modeled for us. We fill in the gaps with what we believe to be true at the time so that we feel safe. It's a safety way, a mechanism to feel to support ourselves. But the problem is, as we get older, some of those skills and strategies that helped us feel safe at the time that are so, so important, we're not trying to sever them, but we want to understand that some of them may not be helping us in current time. So the rinsing allows the hurt and the pain to have a voice. And so we can reclaim our own voice and then process where the hurt is so it's not stuck. And we get to metabolize the pain so that we can plant new seeds. And I always say it's like kind of like the mud that grows new beginnings of how we want to be in relationship with ourselves and how we want to be in relationship with other people. But it does take work, and it's not a fast track, and it's not like you can't take a pill and just make it better. You have to commit to taking ownership of what lives inside. And that is also what's super liberating about it too.
I love everything that you've shared. I'm like nodding like a yeah, so much great stuff there. And just that reminder about how grief can really get lodged in our bodies. And some people may have never kind of thought about intergenerational trauma, and how you may not feel like there has been even sort of grief in your childhood, but maybe your parents had been grieving.
Yes.
And you were carrying some of that grief as well.
Well, I want to say what you said about that. I didn't know till I was later, till I was a little older, that my parents had a child. I had a brother who lived for about 3 months and died. So, and then my mom had a lot of grief as she had a really messed up childhood that she never told me, but I mean, really messed up. So much pain and abandonment. She didn't tell me ever about it. She tried to shield me from all of it, but she couldn't, because I picked it up because we're energetic, empathic creatures. And especially like the loss and the death that was in the family but wasn't talked about, we can pick that up. And so if we try to logical rationalize our pain, it doesn't work, because pain doesn't move in a logical, rational way. It moves, it goes past, present, and future so quickly, just like, so our feelings do. That's why we can be triggered by something that happened 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And if we try to go, well, that makes no sense, then we will shut ourselves down. It's like, it doesn't need to make sense. It's just what you're feeling at this moment needs a place to process. And it's so much of reconnecting to our wisdom and our intuition, and I think that's why so many indigenous cultures, and for me, where I grew up, there was a lot of like Native American presence. And what I always felt when I'd ride my horse out into the hills, like where I felt connected to the ritual of being connected to spirit and nature and the earth, and to remember, like to keep remembering who we truly are, because we all get programmed and our minds get colonized. And I don't even say it from a way of like it's bad or wrong. It just is. I'm like, that's just what happens. So to reclaim that takes effort, and it takes a way to decolonize, to rinse and release some of that narrative that we have internalized. And long before COVID, I mean, long before COVID, I used to call this, and Mona did too, the spiritual flu. And metaphorically, somebody can give us the flu and it could suck and we can be pissed off about it and really upset. But once we have the flu, only we can heal it. The flu now lives inside my own system. It's not fair. It's not right, or whatever, but it just is. And so if we want to reclaim our personal power and our relationship with our truth, then we have to get really raw and honest. And I think that's where grief is also important to mention. When we are losing parts of ourselves and our identity to reclaim our light and our wisdom, we have to shed some of these narratives. And that can feel like its own sense of grief and death, because that old narrative kept me safe at a certain time in my life. And to let go of that narrative can feel like a death. But that also is part of the risk of letting go of what is keeping me held back. And that can be really daunting for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we can kind of start going, oh, actually, I don't know whether I'm ready for that transformation. Maybe I'll just stay in the safe place that I'm used to because it feels so painful to like do the transformation or so scary.
Yeah.
And that grief can be, well, it is a transformative process. Um, and the idea of, just not being afraid of the difficult feelings and to, if because it is daunting and scary to seek support while you're going through it. And you talked about you felt that spiritual connection out in nature on your horse. Um, I wanted to ask you, personally, like why you think yoga can be so supportive. Whenever friends are going through something, I just say, go to yoga. Don't come to, I'm not saying that to come to do yoga with me. And there's so many different types of yoga, but just get to a yoga class. And it's amazing how people always go, oh yeah, I forgot I should do that. Like, why do you feel like it's so supportive, particularly for people who are grieving?
I think I agree with you. I think going to a yoga class is really helpful, but I would also be very discerning about the teacher that you go to and the style that you go to, because some styles can be not um, helpful in terms of getting into your body. And there is a plethora of styles and teachers. And I think it's really important to go to somebody that you feel nurtured. Because when you're going through grief, you do need to get close to the ground and close to yourself. And I think that's why yoga is so helpful. You get to breathe and quiet, all the choppiness of the mind and really drop into yourself. But it's really important that you have a safe space to feel seen and heard and held in that way. Because I have gone to some classes where I feel like teachers have been shaming, and I'm so not about that. No shame. Like you want to go to a very inclusive yoga class where you are encouraged to take really good care of yourself and listen to the needs of your body. And I think that's why when we breathe and we tune into what our bodies need and what we're feeling at that moment, it gives us a really safe space to be in a relationship with what is and not push it down, not avoid it, and also be really nurturing and compassionate with ourselves. So yoga, which means is union. There's so many different definitions of yoga, but one that I really love is from the Bhagavad Gita, skill in action. So we're taking action, but we're learning to be more skillful, not like, doing it right, but more skillful in being in presence with what we're thinking and what we're feeling, and being very receptive and accepting of what we need to nurture ourselves in that type of skill set. And it's something that's more internal and more intuitive. And I think it really helps build a resource of self guidance or inner guidance. So that's why I was like, it's so great and so wonderful. And the discernment of the teacher, the style, and the time of day. I would even say the time of day. Some people, when you're going through something that's really overwhelming, a certain time of day is going to be more conducive to nurturing yourself in that, and especially in a group environment. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, it's a practice about, getting closer to yourself and self-nurturing. And that can be, if you haven't got a yoga practice, that can be a pretty daunting place if you've never done. And which is why we go to the addiction, right? And we tune out because we don't want to like be still and just be with ourselves, because that's scary in itself.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's so interesting when, Shavasana, which is the pose that we do at the end of the practice, which means corpse pose. It literally means death. And one of my teachers said years ago, and I always go back to this, corpse pose is teaching us and reminding us and preparing us for the last breath we will ever take. That the end of the practice is a reminder that everything ends. And that could be, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to be in relationship with when we are I don't think sometimes we have conversations that are open and supportive around that. It's like there's so much in the world of like, keep going, keep doing, keep building. And it's like, no, everything ends. And it's a sweet reminder. And I think that's why sometimes people have a hard time staying in Shavasana. But the idea is when you start the practice, typically the way I teach too, when you move and you breathe, you clear out some of the mental cobwebs, the physical tension and the gripping, so that you're more in relationship with the elements of who you are. So at the end, there is that feeling of getting so close to the ground and knowing, and I think a lot of ways going to a class, that you're not alone, right? You're not meant to do, sometimes our grief and our sadness or the tenderness where we are, it needs to be shared in community. And I think that's what we're shifting in our paradigm right now too. It's not this like lone solo thing I have to do by myself. We need community, and it's a strength to ask for support. It's a strength to be vulnerable. It's a strength to be tender and intimate, because that's where we get to really be in relationship with our hearts and our compassion. And I think yoga keeps reminding us to keep that open quality. And when we're in integration, like our physical, our mental, emotional, our spiritual are in integration, even if it's for 5 minutes, it keeps reminding us to come back to what we really value. And in that valuing, then the loss and the letting go. And I think also the courage to take risks again, because it can feel very risky to put ourselves out there into new endeavors, because it's like, well, what if it doesn't work? I hear this a lot with people. It's like, what if it, this relationship or this move, or what if it doesn't work out? And it's like, well, yeah, it may or may not, but you have you, and you will support yourself. Like you have the strength and the connection inside, no matter what life gives you, that it's all teaching you how to be in relationship with loss and letting go to build new things as well. You take that, like I was thinking, like taking it like kindling wood. It's like, okay, this didn't work, so I'm going to take that as wood and kind of burn the alchemy and transform it into something like wisdom or a gift that I get to bring into the next expression of wherever I'm going.
Yeah, that's so important, because we're so attached to like the outcomes of how we think things should be. So when we start to go through different losses and shifts and transformations and doing work around it and gaining understanding and wisdom and insight, then we are more able to take the risk again. But if we hadn't have done all of those things, then we would just stay in our little safe place.
Yes, so much. Because even that safety, it does feel, and sometimes you need to stay there for a while. And we say, like, sometimes you need to stay in that safe place to ground yourself or to regather your resources. And then you're ready for the next, iteration of who you are and what you want to do. Because the more that you, I think, go through those losses and allow yourself to grieve the sadness and the sorrow, that it doesn't last forever. And it will, some can come back at times, but you have more skill, if you will, in being in relationship with it. I'm not going to turn it down or turn it away. I know it's part of my humanness, and it's part of all the different feelings and emotions. I always say feelings are like a school of fish. Like when we allow all the feelings to move together, it helps us move forward in the ocean of life. Like if you watch a school of fish in the ocean, they move together and they're like, it's so beautiful to watch, and they kind of flow and they go back and forward. But if you take one feeling and you shut it down and call it bad, let's say sadness or sorrow, and go, nope, not going to go there, not going to feel it. It just gets stuck, and it's like a little goldfish in a bowl. I love a metaphor. And it just swims around, and it just starts spinning and spinning and spinning. So the next time you go through something that brings up sadness, it feels so overwhelming because the feeling has been pushed down, and we just like, well, I don't know how to do sadness, so let me go do something else that will numb it out or neglect it. But oftentimes what we're numbing and neglecting is our capacity to be in our truth and holding ourselves and building trust. I feel like we build trust with ourselves. I hear that a lot too. It's like about trusting other people. People are going to do what people are going to do. You can't control anybody else ever. But what you can, and I don't like even use the word control, connect to, is how I trust myself to hold boundaries. And boundaries are not walls. I feel like so many people get confused that boundaries are walls. I'm like, no, boundaries are fluid. But boundaries mean that it's like a screen door. I can see in and out, but I am consciously filtering what I'm allowing in and what I'm giving out so that I am taking really safe and tender care of myself and my inner child.
Yeah. I feel like I love that, by the way, the fish. I'm gonna always remember that. Such a great vision. And I feel a little bit like you may have answered this question. But I like to ask everybody, what is your interpretation of conscious grief?
My interpretation of conscious grief is whenever you make anything conscious, you allow it to be okay. You allow it to be part of you. And you sit in ceremony with that. And I feel like when we make grief conscious, we're not pushing it down or pushing it away. We're like, oh, this is a part of my humanness. So grief becomes a container where I sit in union, or I sit in sort of ritual with my sadness and my sorrow and my hurt. And I give it a place to move so that it moves me into some of the most tender, vulnerable places of myself. And that's where I come into union with my spirit, my human life, that all of it is a teacher. It's all. So we make grief conscious, we learn, and the grit that we have to go through grows us into new expressions of who we are and how we show up. I always say, in my yoga teaching, no mud, no lotus. Without the mud, you don't get the blossoms. And you have way more than one in a lifetime. It's like you got to go down into the mud, and it's dirty and sometimes hard and it's gritty. And sometimes you have to swim with the scary stuff. But when you make that conscious, then it doesn't sit in the subconscious and actually be informing your life in a lot of ways, where that grief will shut us down or block us from taking risks or putting ourselves out there and love deeply, because we're like, well, what if I get hurt? Or what if it doesn't work out? So when we make the grief conscious, we allow ourselves to be, I think, in relationship with all the parts of who we are, which for me goes back to, we welcome all the vibes. Like, I do not like good vibes only. Whenever I see that, I know you sent me a little something. I'm like, no, good vibes only is the ultimate spiritual bypass. I was like, no, this is the binary of the thinking of the world. This is good and this is bad. Well, why is this bad? Why are we calling this bad? If you call something bad, you shut it down and you will not understand its meaning and purpose. And so many people call things bad. And then I'm like, well, that stuff is sitting down there in the subconscious, informing a lot of your choices. And then we do the spiritual bypass, whatever that is. Like, I'm not going to look at that and just put up an image or a picture, or, I think a lot of addict energy is rooted in that. I just want to feel good. If your goal is to feel good all the time, you will not go towards grief and pain and sorrow. And then you're missing so much wisdom. So when we welcome all the vibes, like all the feelings as teachers, then we are in relationship with all parts of who we are, and we're in our authenticity. And truly, that is a place where our confidence and our courage to live a life of meaning and purpose resides.
Amazing, Mia. That is just wow, really incredible. Thank you so much. And we've come to the end, but I want people to know that how they can find you. So let them know.
So my website is miatogo.com. So MIATOGO, like to go. And I'm on my social media, mostly on Instagram. I do have a Facebook account, but I don't really use it that much. But my Instagram is my name too, Mia Togo. And I do coaching courses. I have one that's called Coming Home to Wholeness. I was going to do one this spring, but I've put it off. I postponed it till the fall. There's just too many things going on right now. So I really love doing those coaching courses where it brings people together in community so that we realize how much more alike we are. And so many of our challenges, sometimes our struggles are, maybe different permutations or different expressions, but at the root, I think coming into community and being seen and seeing other people is such a sweet, safe space where we can nurture each other's growth with so much compassion.
Yeah, I completely agree. So thank you so much. And also you do teach classes online through YogaWorks as well. So people can take a yoga class with you wherever, right? And obviously you teach in London.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I teach for Yoga Works. It's a big school and studio. It was started in 1987 in Santa Monica. It's an amazing school. I feel so, even now, like I've been practicing for almost, 30 years. The system, and it's not like a dogmatic, rigid system, but the system of moving your body in a way that has a directionality and it's so safe has really kept me healthy physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I really stand by it. So yogaworks.com, and you can take it, yeah, any time of the day because I'm teaching in London. So if you're wherever you are in the world, you check out the website. I teach three classes in person, two classes at Love Supreme Projects here in West London, which is an amazing studio on Goulburn Road. And I teach one class on Monday evenings at Camden Tri Yoga, which is also another great studio. And that's a whole vibe. It's such a great community that shows up there too. So I'm really grateful to have like community across the world, across the pond, everywhere.
Completely. Oh, thank you so much, Mia. It's
Yeah.
been wonderful meeting you and talking to you, sharing your work and your wisdom, so much wisdom. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for all the work you're doing and putting out there. I think these conversations are so important to have and are so meaningful to lots of folks. Like stuff, and and one other thing too, because we're coming through. I'm not saying we're done with the pandemic, but that's also brought up a lot of loss for people and grief about how life was and how it is. And even though it appears to be kind of like back to some regularity or normality, we're not the same. Things have shifted on such a fundamental level, and I think that's really important to name. So if you're feeling this, shift or this grief or loss of how things were, or sometimes relationships have changed, these conversations are really important to support other people and know that you're not alone. It's so important to know that we're not alone.
Yeah, it truly is. It truly is.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone who's been listening and watching. Hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have enjoyed being the interviewer. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.